What happened to that person you know that was murdered? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My great-grandfather, he was found dead in his house, shot with his own long hunting rifle. His death was ruled a suicide. Truthfully, everyone knew the man who had done it and that he and his brothers had conspired to do so. But my great-grandfather was definitely not a good man. He had molested his own children when they were young, went on to molest some of his grandchildren, and in the meantime had molested a great many of his neighbors' children to boot. Everyone knew it, but no one could ever prove it. This was back in the day when you couldn't file charges based on a child's word and children couldn't testify in court. So when he died, the entire community said, "What a shame." Then, behind closed doors, they hoped he rotted in hell and quietly wished they could thank his killers. I had a friend, Tony, who was a recovering heroin addict. We became friends around 3 or 4 years after he got clean and moved to the city. He was probably the nicest guy I've ever met in my life. We were friends for another 5 years before he passed. Someone from his hometown came to visit him one weekend. Tony's girlfriend found him in his apartment. That friend had completely disappeared. Nobody knows what happened, but his neck was broken, skull fractured in the back, and he had more than enough heroin in his system to kill him. No idea what happened first, but I get angry when I think about whatever could have happened. Murder-suicide. My friend, 14 female, was killed by a family friend, middle-aged male, who then killed himself. He was her dad's best friend. It was over 15 years ago and still makes me sad to think about. My ex was murdered by his father's schizophrenic boyfriend. He was hit from behind with an axe, chopped up, and the flesh stripped from his bones, and was fried and disposed of in several streams. It's one of my country's worst murders and is known as die Wokmoord, the stir-fried murder. A cousin of mine in 1998, I was 15, I think he was 23, was run off the road and beaten to death, left in a ditch. They knew him. It was over a woman, I believe. Why there was an open casket, I will never understand. They had to wrap his neck up because his throat was slit, hands covered in gloves because he was defending himself, and they were pretty jacked up apparently. He and I were not close, but that was still family. There were 12 grandkids on that side. He was the 3rd or 4th oldest. I was the 3rd or 4th youngest. The murderer have just recently been released. He was in the Navy and engaged. Stabbed to death in her apartment, murder for hire. The killer confessed several years later while in jail on other charges, but is yet to reveal who was behind it. Small-town crime is wild. A teacher at the community college I went to was stabbed to death by his son. My teacher used to talk about the issues he had with his son that battled substance abuse, and they didn't have the best relationship. He was an amazing teacher, who I had for several classes, and he truly made learning enjoyable. I remember the first day of class with him calling roll call, and he said my name sounded like a pirate's wife, and that's when I instantly knew I was in for a treat with him as a teacher. This still messes with me to this day, mostly because the last thing we did before he passed was fight about really dumb shit. Right before it happened, he tried calling me one night, not sure about what. Dude drank a shitload, and always needed rides and whatnot. He was a blast to hang out with, lots of laughs, women loved him, he was pretty good at pool, etc. But I just needed some time away from the constant partying, and I felt at the time he was leaning on me too much, so I ignored the call. I assumed he was wasted given the time of night. 2 days later, I get a phone call at 7:52 a.m. I worked as a restaurant manager. Nobody that knew me called me before 10 a.m., and the person that was calling for sure knew that, so I figured it was important. He was dead, by suicide. It didn't all add up, and here's what still boggles my mind. He started a pizza on a pizzazz. The front door was wide open. He always left his keys in his car, and they were nowhere to be found. Admittedly, this one doesn't mean much specifically, but it was weird. He drove a Taurus and used the electronic keypad to get in and out. His blood alcohol content was nowhere near what I expected, and given his tolerance, he was likely very aware. The way the shotgun blast hit him, he would have had to have pulled the trigger with his toe or use a stick or a rope or something, and none of that was anywhere near him. And he had big, bulky boots on. It was his gun, there was no doubt there. He used it for deer and pheasant hunting. It was his ammo too, but no fingerprint on the shell. not even his, which he could have had gloves on when he loaded last, very possible, but again weird. Nor were there good prints of his own gun, and he was barehanded. I would have thought the recent handling would have left a few fresh ones. There's a few more, but I'm also not going to pretend I'm a ballistics expert. I know he was getting in deep with gambling and probably had a huge debt with a bookie, or maybe he effed the wrong person's lady. He just got a new job, and he was very excited about, so that always confused me too. Maybe it was just suicide, I don't know. I've talked about this with mutual friends, and we all agree that anything mentioned above was actually possible. I still wonder what he was calling about that night. There's certainly a level of guilt that I've carried for a long time. It's been 13 years, and I haven't deleted his number from my phone contacts. She was always cagey about her past and would refuse to broach the subject if I pressed, so we never did. Well, someone from her past showed up, and she gave him a place to stay, and then he murdered her a few days later. So, her past apparently wasn't very nice. He was caught and is serving life in a Florida prison. A guy I went to school with was stabbed in the neck by his girlfriend and left to die in the front garden. A 17-year-old kid from my town fancied himself as a gangster, got too big for his boots, and taunted a well-known hitman. He was tortured, murdered, and dismembered with his body parts left outside the house of his associates. A mate of a mate worked in a local pub. He stopped a fight during a shift, with one guy coming back to the bar with a knife and stabbed him through the heart for his troubles. A pseudo-cousin was stabbed 30 to 40 times by a random dude and his buddy. These two guys had casually decided that it would be fun to find a woman and to kill her to see what would happen. From the DNA evidence, it's clear that my cousin had also had sex with both of these guys, although it's unclear whether it was consensual or not, or whether she was alive or not. The guys both had diaries, and at least one of them wrote about how it would be fun to have sex with a corpse. They didn't find her body for 2 to 3 weeks after the murders, which was during a heat wave, so the physical evidence was a mess, needless to say. My cousin's then toddler twin sons were adopted by her sister, and they are doing well. Both guys got life sentences without parole, but somehow avoided execution. This was 20 plus years ago, so I don't remember all of the details. I wasn't close to this cousin or her immediate family, although they were very nice people. Pseudo-cousin means that she was adopted by my mother's brother and his wife, so she was a relative but not a blood relative. Assuming you're being serious, here's mine. This is a throwaway account of sorts, and the newspapers never really caught on to this story, but here we go. Early 2000s, my grandmother started dating this guy who turned out to be a raging alcoholic. She thought she could fix him, but he always relapsed. He was never violent, but the fights were always verbal and emotional. Soon they were just living together as acquaintances because I guess my grandmother felt bad for him. 2014, she kicks him out for good, and he goes to live at his mother's house. She was recently put in a nursing home for dementia. About 5 years ago, I was visiting my grandmother for the 4th of July. Because it was a small town with low crime, she always kept the front door open, but the screen door locked due to the heat. On this night in particular, I was sitting on the couch, less than 10 feet from the screen door, when her cat started freaking out. Her ex-boyfriend lived almost 2 miles away, so I suppose the paranoia of him showing up unexpectedly always lingered in the back of my mind. Her cat just kept pawing and hissing through the screen door, so I finally closed it. It's important to note that he only does that when he's under severe stress or if a stranger is around. 2 days later, when I'm back at my own house, my grandmother informed me that someone slashed 2 of the tires to her car. The first night I was gone, the cat started freaking out again, but this time it was my grandmother who noticed. About a week after that revelation, I was informed that my grandmother's ex was found dead. A neighbor had gone to do a wellness check and found his bloated, decaying body in one of the back bedrooms. He's been dead for about 3 days, and the July weather had sped things up. He was cremated, as requested by his will. No children, no siblings, and his mother was too far gone with dementia, so it was very distant family that came to his memorial service. Most of them were really shitty people, and one of them asked out loud during the service speech who was going to get the house. Honestly, I was convinced that alcohol poisoning had killed him, but I was told a few things by my grandmother that imply otherwise, and before anyone thinks she was involved, she was only informed with this stuff because the ex had no close family. His own mother had to be told repeatedly that her son was dead, but due to her dementia, she forgot within minutes. And in all honesty, my grandmother wouldn't be capable of committing a crime, especially since having had a stroke and going through a slew of health problems. Also, what motive would she have had? Guy wasn't rich, and she wanted nothing to do with him once he left her house. When I went to visit her several weeks later, she seemed more on edge than usual. That's when she revealed that according to the coroner, blunt force trauma had been documented in his autopsy report. Not only that, but his car keys and wallet were found in a grocery store dumpster several miles away, yet his own car had been in the driveway when his body was discovered. Nothing made sense, and I'm honestly not sure what to believe. As far as we knew, he didn't have any enemies and wasn't wealthy. I refuse to believe that he just fell, hit his head, and died because he was so drunk. How does that explain where his car keys and wallet were found? I have two theories. 1. Someone had been scoping out the neighborhood, fixated on the boyfriend's house, followed his movements or schedule, and broke in. But there were apparently no signs of a struggle, so he was probably heavily intoxicated when he was attacked. Some of his mother's old jewelry was apparently taken, so I leaned towards the idea of a violent burglar or opportunist. 2. He hired someone to harass my grandmother, just enough to scare her. Maybe this third party wasn't compensated enough for their time or just simply betrayed him. It's plausible because that would explain the cat's strange behavior and the fact that my grandmother's tires were slashed. The ex-boyfriend would have been too drunk or goofy to do that, and the cat would have freaked out because he would have recognized the boyfriend. So yeah, I'm pretty sure I know someone who was most likely murdered if I was being told the truth. I used to hang out at the house he died in because I would keep his elderly mother company when she was alive several years ago. I'll never feel comfortable going back there, even if given the opportunity, and I heard that the smell still lingers. I know several. One was a murder-suicide of a middle-aged couple who lived up the road from me. Another was a 19-year-old student battered to death by a druggy ex-boyfriend. It's not exciting. It's terrifying, traumatic, and desperately sad. These events happened a long time ago, but they've never left us. Next-door neighbor killed 2 people one night. Then he led cops on high-speed chase, and after that got into a shootout. They sicked their dogs on him, but he was dead in his vehicle. He first killed the tow truck driver, and then the guy who worked at a gas station. Crazy thing is, his little brother got into a shootout with cops months later and is serving 45 years. I was always scared of these guys, but never thought it would happen like this. When I was a kid, I used to play with a girl neighbor of mine. She was a kid too. We lived in not so good of a neighborhood. Another neighbor kidnapped and killed her and her brother. I think he chopped them up and put them in trash bags. The cops were suspicious of the guy after they knocked on his door and arrested him sometime later. He got a lethal injection. I used to play with her almost every day. We moved away from that neighborhood after it happened before they caught him. Makes me sad and cry when I think about it. In the 1980s, I was a real estate agent. I helped a couple sell their home and buy another larger and nicer home. About a year later, I picked up a newspaper to find the wife had been arrested for hiring 2 students, she was a teacher's aide, to kill the husband. The husband had moved out of their home and moved in with 2 other women. I was dumbfounded. They seemed like a happily married couple. The boys were found guilty, and I don't remember their sentence. The wife was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. I testified at her pre-sentencing hearing because I honestly couldn't believe she could have done what they said. She and I had spent a lot of time together looking for their new house, and she seemed like a refined, friendly, normal woman. I felt sorry for his family for their loss. This is not really about a guy I knew that was murdered, but he died for sure. I had a friend that I knew from Thai boxing training. He was such a nice guy. We were in the same school. There was this one younger guy, and he was always saying shit about him being adopted, which was true, and making fun of him. So once he punched him in the belly because he had enough of him making fun of him. The younger kid starts crying as loud as he can, and there was this old grumpy teacher. All of this happened in school, by the way. And she told my friend that she will tell this to his parents and that he will go back to the adoption center. And that's what she shouldn't do. He was so scared he'll go back to the orphanage home that the first thing his parents saw when they came back home from work was just him dead. He committed suicide by hanging himself. His parents are suing the teacher to this day And this happened back in 2011.